that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun it shall never go down. There are evergreen trees that been low in the breeze, and their fruitage is brighter than gold. There the throne of God stands in the fairest of lands, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun it shall never go down. There's a home in that land at the Father's right hand. There are mansions whose joys are untold, and perennial spring, where the saints ever sing, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun it shall never go down.
I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Through this world of toil and snares, if I falter, Lord, who cares? Who with me my burden shares? None but thee, dear Lord, none but thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. When my feeble life is old, from shore to thy shore. Just a closer walk with thee. Grant it, Jesus, is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Though you are far away, wonderful story of love, still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, e'en from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love, 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 wonderful story of love. Jesus provides a rest. Wonderful story of love.
Hopefully I'll line this up right. And people watching online are going to get that connection. We've never seen a POV camera view before walking out into the room. So we're looking at the question of Israel and not Israel only. And so we want to start in chapter 1 and some of the things that were told in chapter 1. The book opens obviously with the fact that it's the genealogy of Christ, but not with his connection to anyone other than Abraham. I mean, to Abraham through David, and that becomes an important aspect in another respect. But Abraham is the terminal point. There's a reason for that. It doesn't open with Moses. It doesn't open with the law. It doesn't open with Israel. Was Abraham a part of Israel? No, Israel didn't. The man that the nation Israel was named after hadn't even been born in the time of Abraham. So why is Abraham so important? Because there is this promise that is made to Abraham that through him all nations would be blessed. That's an important promise, and the fact that it draws your attention to that promise at literally the first sentence of the gospel is significant, because it is telling us that this message, and what's the word gospel mean? Good news. That's why we call it the gospel. This good news about salvation in Christ, about the person Jesus, about all that Jesus accomplished, about what he taught, this good news was intended for all nations. Through your seed, all nations will be blessed. So what's being established here, at least in the very early foundational sense, is this category of people that is created by promise and by faith. One of the things that is particularly important about Abraham's character, as we read about him all through Genesis and as he's brought up over and over and over again throughout the scriptures, is about Abraham's faith. That was, it had moments of weakness, to be fair, but that was consistent across his interaction with God. Because our introduction to Abraham is Abraham living in a place with a people that were not people that were associated with God. And God calls him and says, what? Get your stuff and head out, and then I'll tell you where to go. Leave your family, leave your life. And Abraham was a wealthy man. You have to assume he had a productive existence in this place, and with all the things that go with that. How many of you could just, I'm going to say to you, hey, go home, collect your things, and go. I'll tell you later where to go. Just get your stuff and leave. How many of you would be able to easily do that? We just moved my in-laws 120 miles. And it took, I don't know, 8 weeks. And that was fast-tracked. And we're still trying to tie up loose ends and take care of things that hadn't been taken care of yet. It's not easy for you to just do. But Abraham, now you can do it. You can do it if you want to just do what? Just walk away from all those things, which is what Abraham had to do. How much faith does it take to hear a message from a God that you do not know, who says, get your stuff and leave, and I'll tell you later what I have in store for you and where you're going to go? And you leave not knowing where you're going. How much faith does it take to do that? And so this is very early on in Abraham's interaction with God. And again, like I said, there are moments of weakness with Abraham, but there is a consistent pattern of what? An amazing level of faith that obeys, and I guess is culminated in its pinnacle example, even to the point of what? Sacrificing his only promised son. Now, he had another son, but it had been made clear that the promise was not going to be fulfilled through that son. It was going to be through this one. And when he's yet a lad, whatever that means, I don't know exactly how old he was at that moment. But when he was yet a lad, God says, you take him off and you go up to the mountain and you offer a sacrifice. And what the Hebrew writer teaches us in chapter 11 about that is that Abraham considered that God was able to do what? Raise him from the dead. If it was required that he raise him, in other words, Abraham had gotten to the point, and you got to keep in mind in the story earlier, he had actually pled with God to just fulfill the promise through Ishmael. I've already got a son. Why can't you just do it through him? God said, no, I told you you would have a son with your wife. You need to trust me. You're going to have a son with your wife. He actually sent messengers at one point and said, it's going to be a year from now. You're going to have a son with your wife. The problem is at that point in time, how old was he? He was 99 and she was 90 or nearabouts. They were 190 respectively, I believe, when he was born. And the language of the scriptures in one place describing that is she was as good as dead. Not physically, but what? Her childbearing years were behind her. How much faith did it take to trust that the child was actually going to be born? But it gets beyond that, because when the child is a lad, you know at that point, we're 10 years further down the road, 14, 15, 16, 17 years further down the road. somewhere down the road, more than a decade, and God says, all right, now take him up on the mountain and kill him. And at this point, instead of Abraham thinking, what did I forfeit my promise? Have I lost it somehow? Abraham instead says what? If God needs to raise him from the dead, that's what God will do. God will fulfill his promise. That kind of confidence in the word of God is what we're talking about. And this goes back to our discussion last week about whether we will listen to Jesus. Hear ye him. Will I have that kind of confidence in what Jesus said, that I will move forward even if the way looks impossible? The genealogy itself of Jesus, as recorded in Matthew 1, anticipates inclusion beyond Israel. It's the purpose of Matthew's genealogy. Matthew's genealogy is a little different than the other recorded genealogy of Jesus. And it does something a little different than most genealogies. When you're tracing the genealogy of firstborn sons, what do you usually trace? Men, males. This man begot this man, begot this man, begot this man. There is a direct line between this person and this person and this person and this person. What does he do here? Well, let's see. There's Tamar, there's Rahab, there's Ruth, there's the wife of Uriah, all included in the list. For what purpose? Well, what do we know about Tamar and Rahab and Ruth and the wife of Uriah? They were not Hebrews. And yet here they're stuck in his genealogy. As part of the proof of his personhood and his connection to the promise of Abraham. That's why it's done. And I'll also add this, they're not males. And so you see here in Matthew 1, the foundation being laid for something that we're taught later, that in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither male nor female, there's neither slave nor free. It doesn't matter what ethnicity you are, what gender you are, what station you have. If you are a living, breathing human being, what can you have? Salvation in Christ. It wasn't connected to Israel in that way. It was connected to Israel, but not in the exclusive way. Instead, Israel was serving the purpose of doing what? Bringing it about. It was the channel through which the promise was fulfilled, which, by the way, is the subject matter of what, 2/3 of the book of Genesis. Which is tracing this man and which one of his sons was chosen to be the channel through which the promise that was made to Abraham was going to be fulfilled. And then that man and which one of his sons was chosen to be. And by the way, it wasn't always the oldest son. At times it was the second born. Other times it was the fourth born that was chosen to be the conduit. And we see some reasons for that. And then you get these weird anomaly characters like Joseph, who didn't have anything to do with that line at all, other than the fact that he did what? He preserved his brothers so that that line could be carried forth. And so It's this anticipation of inclusion beyond Israel. There's already outsiders involved in the discussion right here in chapter 1. And so we have to understand that God's work was never restricted to ethnic or gender boundaries. Never. And it's a mistake to allow ourselves to fall into that trap. That is a trap that is very uniquely human nature, and that I believe arises from the lies of the devil. He wants us to believe that ethnicity matters. He wants us to believe that gender matters. He wants us to believe in these distinctions. He wants us to make decisions and show preference to people of stature over people who have no stature, because that divides us and prevents us from accomplishing the purpose of God. What was the purpose of God for bringing Jesus into the world? Give you a hint, it's expressly stated in John chapter 3. Little minor hint. Anybody? God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him. What does that language mean, whosoever? Anyone, any person that believes in him might have life. That's the purpose. And all of those other things that get in our way of accomplishing that is, I'm convinced, the lies of the devil. It's where he started, right? First thing he did was to say something to try to shift the first created people away from God. Israel's priority is stated rather clearly in Matthew 10 and Matthew 15. We shouldn't lose sight of that. We shouldn't take the truth that the gospel was intended from its outset to bless whosoever, and think that means that Israel didn't have some place and some priority in the story. They did. There's some explicit limitation that's given on the mission of the 12 when they're sent out in Matthew 10, verses 5 and 6. Go nowhere among the Gentiles, they're told, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. This is very unambiguous. Israel received the gospel first. The kingdom is not detached from Israel. It is very much connected to Israel. And we're supposed to know that to help us do what? To believe, to identify the true promise. Are there false Christs in the world? How do we know the false Christ from the real Christ? Well, we follow that line of promise as it's laid out in Genesis. And it carries through the remainder of the Old Testament all the way up to the Gospels, showing us that direct connection between the promise of Abraham to the person of Jesus, so that we can know that the nation of Israel played a critical role in our ability to recognize Jesus for who he was. Jesus' own statement of the mission. If you go to Matthew 15 and verse 24, listen to what he says about his own place in his teaching and function and work on the earth. I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, that is not an absolute statement in purpose. That's a limit for where they were at in this mission while he was on the earth. It was not yet time. There was actually a very clearly stated progression of the message of the gospel down to the city. Where was it to go first? Jerusalem. Where did it go from there? To Judea. Well, what is Judea? What, not just the Jewish people, but specifically the southern half of the Jewish people, particularly the area surrounding Jerusalem, the descendants of Judah. Who was Jesus from? The line of Judah. In Judea. And then he said, what? Samaria, which moves from the pure line of the descendants of Israel to the mixed descendants of Israel. And then after Samaria was to receive it, then who was to receive it? The uttermost parts of the earth. So this is a clear line of direction. And at this point in time, when Jesus is teaching and working, his work is primarily to Israelites. Does that mean that he never engages with those who are not Israelites? No. But there is one really interesting conversation where he even asked the person who comes to him, is it right to give the food off the table to the dog instead of to the children? And that sounds very offensive to us, but what's the point that he's making there? Tell you what the point is. There's a progression. And it's not time for that yet. And everything was done on a very specific divine timeline. The text doesn't deny the nations. That's not what you find in the book of Matthew. You find it instead establishing an order. And first, it was to the house of Israel. And so then the promise moves through Israel, not around Israel. You will not find the promise outside of Israel. You find the promise through Israel. And then Matthew does something else in connection with this, and we see this in chapter 8 and in chapter 15. You notice that common chapter 15 to the previous point. Faith is recognized beyond Israel in the book of Matthew. Who can be faithful to God? And they had the concept of what? Well, only the people of the law can be faithful to God. The law of Moses. And again, that concept continued to hang on for many years after this time. But already here in Matthew, he starts laying the foundation that there's something that can be had apart from the law that's critical. And my favorite example of that is in Matthew chapter 8. Look at Matthew chapter 8 verse 10. And really the whole story is Matthew 8, 15 through 13. In fact, that's not long, and we've got 9 minutes. Probably shouldn't read it, but I think I'm going to. Look at Matthew chapter 8 with me. We'll start reading in verse 5 and read through about verse 13. When he entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him. Okay, what's a centurion? Okay, it's a Roman soldier who's over about approximately 100 men, a Roman officer. What do we know about Roman officers? They're Roman. They're not Jews. He entered Capernaum. A centurion came to him, pleading with him, Lord, my servant is lying at home, paralyzed in terrible agony. He said to him, am I to come to heal him? Lord, the centurion replied, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. Now, that's amazing right there, because listen, the Romans are not one step behind Westerners in the modern world, or Americans in the modern world, who believe what? There's no one greater than us. And yet he says, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof. Which is saying what? I recognize that you're greater than me. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed. Verse 9, for I too am a man under authority, having soldiers under my command. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. Hearing this, Jesus was amazed and said to those following him, and I want you to notice that language. He changes the subject of his conversation. He's no longer talking only to this Roman soldier. He turns and talks to his disciples. Truly, I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with so great a faith. I tell you that many will come from east and west to share the banquet with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness, where there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus told the centurion, go, as you have believed, let it be done for you. And his servant was healed that very moment. I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such a faith. Listen, not only was faith in God possible apart from Israel, according to Jesus' own assessment, the greatest and most exemplary faith that he saw was not in Israel, but was in a Roman soldier. Many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham. What's he telling them? It is not just you who's going to be at the table. And it's not just a few. It's not a one-off thing here, there, or yonder, where there's just a couple of non-Israelites who are going to develop faith. But many will come and recline at the table with Abraham. And then he says something even more pointed. Most of you, the Israelites, will be cast into outer darkness, will not be reclining at table with Abraham. By the way, don't miss the connection between his language here and Luke 16 in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, where Lazarus is reclining at Abraham's bosom. In the what? The favored seat at the table with Abraham. It wasn't the rich, it was the poor. It wasn't the one who had everything, it was the leper who had nothing. Another contrast between what we tend to think and what God says is. So the priority that Israel had does not equal exclusion, because faith bridges what lineage cannot bridge. Just because you were a descendant of Abraham meant nothing if you didn't have the faith of Abraham. And that's a terribly important lesson to learn. The Canaanite woman in Matthew 15 is the Matthew 15 example in this case. O woman, great is your faith. Be it done to you as you desire. The interaction begins with a restriction. I was sent only, but it concludes with a commendation based on her faith. So there is an initial distinction between Israel and the others, but then you have this recognition of faith and inclusion on the basis of faith. And that kind of faith has to be the faith that Abraham exhibited, that we talked about in the beginning. And so the defining principle in all this is faith goes over lineage, faith goes over ethnicity, faith goes over gender, faith goes over station, faith goes over everything. The question is, do I have the conviction to listen to God? Not just listen to God, but specifically listen to God through his son. It's in the Hebrew letter. God in times past spoke to us through the prophets in various ways, but in these last days has spoken to us in his son. Do we have the kind of faith in the teaching that emanated from Christ, which involved what we just saw in Matthew today? That we can walk based in confidence about those things. The people of God are not defined merely by descent from Abraham. It's not the children of Abraham in the flesh. They're defined by participation in the kind of faith that belongs to Abraham. It's the children of Abraham in faith. So Matthew's gospel maintains these two truths simultaneously. There's not a contradiction here. The kingdom is directed first to Israel, but it was never limited to Israel. The narrative repeatedly elevates obedient faith as the decisive factor. The inclusion of Gentiles is not a later development. It is embedded from the very beginning. So order doesn't imply exclusivity. Order doesn't imply preeminence. And I'll go ahead and throw this out there for contrast, because we remember, and I think we just studied about it, I think it was last Sunday morning. It was one of the illustrations or examples in the lesson of the disciples, maybe it was Sunday night, of the disciples that were jockeying to be first among the disciples, as if being in a preeminent place, being first, like Israel was first, meant that you were somehow more special than others. What did Jesus teach about that? He said the first will be last and the last will be first. And he told a parable where he taught them that the fellow that comes in at the 11th hour and labors only the last hour of the day is going to get the same reward as the one who came at the first hour when he was first called. Which flew in the face of their thinking. And he was teaching the same thing. Should the Gentiles feel like that they're somehow subordinate because they were called after the Jews? And the answer is no. And that's being set forth from the beginning. Lineage is insufficient. Me tracing my lineage back to the right people is not what I need to do. I need to trace my faith back to the right person. And once we do that, once we can identify that someone is a faithful follower of Jesus, then we can identify the people of God. And it doesn't matter who they are. If they are those who act in faith, they are of God. And they're with us because they are with God. So faith is the defining response. The Abrahamic promise governs the entire process. That the promise made to Abraham was 400 years before the law. It's highlighted for us later. 400 years before the law of Moses was ever given, the promise to Abraham already existed. Which one? You want to talk about order? Which one was first? Well, the promise was. The law didn't disregard the promise. The law worked with the promise to accomplish the promise because it was always about the promise. And that's why Matthew starts with Jesus' connection to Abraham. All right, we're out of time. I didn't hear a second bell, but anybody have any questions or comments to close? All right, thanks for your presence and participation this morning.